Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our presentation today. My name is Scott. I'm with the Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center, and you've tuned in for the Work Inclusion and Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus people webinar on the results of the work that's been done here in Sudbury and Windsor in finding out about the lives and working experiences of people who identify on the queer spectrum. So there's a lot of us that have been involved in this presentation. And for those of you who don't know the Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center, we are a worker center. So we teach people about their rights at work, and we help them to rectify any issues that have been having at work by providing legal information on how they can go about making changes. We also do advocacy for changing the working conditions for all people. So we're very involved in the fight for 15 and fairness and in injured workers concerns and in status for all issues. You can reach us through phone, through email, by dropping in once things are open to our office. And we also offer peer support and learning experiences. And we've in fact got a worker center meeting this evening, which we'll tell you about at the end of the webinar today. It would be lovely if you wanted to continue the conversations and join us. Suzanne Mills, who's the main presenter, is going to be doing sort of more inclusive discussion of thank yous and talking about all the various research partners. And as you can see here, there's a great list. And I just want to acknowledge that we're so pleased to have been part of this project, so pleased that Fierte Sudbury Pride wanted to partner with us for this presentation. It's been really collaborative and wonderful, and we're just so pleased to have been included. So thank you to everybody. Like I say, Suzanne Mills, the chief researcher, will do a much more detailed discussion of all of the various partners. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the land on which we are broadcasting from and on which this research project took place. These are all the lands and water that were originally inhabited and cared for by Indigenous peoples who traveled and resided in these lands from time immemorial. Here where I am in Sudbury, we're in the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the shared territories of the Atikmashing Anishinaabe and the Wanapitei First Nations, and it's all part of what is called in the settler language the Robertson-Huron Treaty. McMaster University in the city of Hamilton is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas peoples. The territory is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Wampum belts are beads bound into strings which narrate Haudenosaunee history, tradition, and laws, and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum was created to bind the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the Great Law of Peace. The dish represents the shared land, while one spoon reinforces the idea of sharing and peace. We further recognize and acknowledge that the Hamilton area is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase from 1792 between the Crown and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. Finally, the University of Windsor and the Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits of Detroit is also within territory and lands honored by wampum treaties, agreements between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenni, Lenape, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources in the Great Lake regions. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Huron-Wendat peoples. And of course, Métis peoples has also inhabited those lands throughout the time in which we're speaking of. And of course, members of Indigenous First Nations from all across Turtle Island now work and live in these shared territories. And I want to just make a special note about this acknowledgement today in terms of our discussion. You know, we've included the term Two-Spirit in our inclusive capturing of the various ways that one can be queer. And Two-Spirit is a translation of the Anishinaabe term Nizi Manduwag, which refers to a person who embodies both a masculine and feminine spirit. Two-spirit peoples were an accepted and indeed in many cases a revered part of Indigenous cultures and were embraced as part of a tradition of inclusiveness. They weren't sort of created as other in the way that so much of our patriarchal colonial culture, settler culture, really creates others. And it's that problem of otherness that has led to this report and to the desperate need for reconciliation between settler cultures and the proud First Nations that first inhabited this land. So I'd just like to make that acknowledgement. I'd like now to introduce our speakers, and if you can just click on your camera briefly while I call your name. So Suzanne Mills is the Associate Professor in the School of Labor Studies and the School of Geography and Earth Sciences at McMaster University, where she has been recognized as university scholars. Mills' research examines gender, sexuality, and work, as well as how colonial relations shape work in Indigenous employment in construction, mining, and forestry. Mills has collaborated with Indigenous communities to identify factors that aid or hinder employment on resource development projects. Suzanne is also currently working with UNIFOR, the United Steelworkers, two worker centers, and multiple LGBTQ plus organizations to examine the experience of LGBTQ plus workers in Windsor and Sudbury, Ontario. Mills has written multiple community reports and published articles in national and international journals, including Environment and Planning A, Geoforum, and Arctic. Benjamin Owens is a recent graduate from the Later Studies MA program at McMaster University, where he studied experiences of customer violence for Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus service sector workers. He currently works as a research assistant on the Two-Spirit LGBTQ plus work and inclusion project and is active in the labor movement and local music scene in his spare time. Vincent Bolt uses he, him pronouns. He is a registered social worker and is the education manager for TG Inner Selves. He obtained his Bachelor of Indigenous Social Work from Laurentian University in 2018, and he is currently completing his Master of Social Work through the University of Victoria. Vincent started doing public speaking in 2006. He continues to visit communities across northeastern Ontario to provide education and inspiration for change. Melody Berube is an outreach worker with the Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center. As a graduate from Laurentian Labour and Environmental Studies program, she is passionate about informing workers of their rights and improving working conditions in Ontario. Melody was a local partner on the Work Inclusion Survey. Bill is a retired Gay General Motors electrician. He was on Uniform's Ontario Regional Pride Committee, his local union's Human Rights Committee, and a workplace health and safety representative. As such, he has been very active in supporting our members in the community and attending 12 Pride events last year, Union Strong. Paul Passanen was born and raised in Sudbury and has lived here for most of his life. Paul has attended Laurentian University and Nipissing University, obtaining degrees in sociology, education, and social work. He is currently working on his master's in social work, researching Two-Spirit, LGBTQ plus community health and safe spaces with the public health Sudbury districts. He has worked as a horticultural technician, occasional teacher, and research assistant. Over the decades of employment, Paul has always maintained strong union involvement and as well as a committed activism for the queer and community in Sudbury. And so those are our speakers. We're going to now head over to Suzanne Mills, who's going to.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Take over. A little bit of technical difficulty there in the background. We're going to hand things over to Suzanne, who's going to present the report. We're then going to hear from each of the speakers. If you've got questions about anything you'd hear, you can put them into the question box or the chat box. Please make sure that you don't include confidential information about your workplace or any of the people that you're working with. This is a public forum, and so please keep that confidential information confidential, and just to ensure that you are sharing general questions. And we'll handle questions at the end, include all questions at the end of the webinar. And now, without any further conversation from me, I'm going to hand things over to Suzanne Mills, who will share the results of the research. So please take it away, Suzanne.
Right. Can people see the presentation? Great. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for both being interested in this research and also to the Worker Center for being part of this research. We're going to share a little bit of the results of the research, but the research can also be found if you go to the Labor Studies website at McMaster University. You can just Google Labor Studies McMaster University, and it should be present as a news item. And also, if you go into the research tab of the website, you will also find the report for more information. So this project was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Next. Oops, sorry. We, as was mentioned, this project involved a lot of people. There were several academic researchers involved, include people at the University of Windsor, University of Southampton, University of Toronto. Ben has been working on this project since he was an undergraduate student in labor studies. So he's been with this project the entire time through his master's, and he's been kind of a central pillar in this project. And we have a number of partners as well. This project was in partnership with the United Steelworkers Canada and Unifor, as well as the Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center and the Windsor Workers Education Center. And Melody, I want to give a little shout out to her as well, that she was very central in implementing this project on the ground in Sudbury. We also had a number of community advisors in both Sudbury and in Windsor. And so at each stage of the project, we solicited advice from community advisors. And then we also had a number of research assistants. And I can check out the names there to the people, Vincent. So why do we do this project? We decided to do this project because often when we think about 2SLGBTQ plus people, we think about large urban centers and we think about white collar workplaces and people who are middle class to upper class. That's how people are portrayed in the media. And we were interested in the experience of people in smaller places and kind of the everyday cities in Canada, in places perhaps that have strong industrial histories. We also know that often LGBT people are left out of labor history and are seen as outside of labor culture. So we also look at places that had strong histories for this reason. So our goal was really to highlight the experiences of 2SLGBTQ people in smaller cities and to understand the impacts that unions and employers have on their well-being. There's some noise in the background. I'm wondering if we could do anything about that.
Working on muting that. Thank you.
Yeah, Bill, I think that's you in the background. If there's any way you can just mute your phone line on your end, that would be really appreciated. We're hearing a lot of background movement.
Will do.
So just to speak briefly about the methodology that we used, we used a community engaged approach that, as Suzanne mentioned, worked with community advisors at every step in the research process.
Mondale, do you want to kick Bill and deal with that?
Yeah, I got it.
Sorry about that.
Unmuted.
Just kick him out, Chandel. We can't.
Is that me?
Yes, that's you, Bill.
Oh, jeez. Got the phone turned right there.
Hang on. I did dismiss him, but he's still here? I'm not sure what's going on.
So, yeah, I've muted it now. I just saw what I was doing.
Ben, do you want to continue?
Yeah, cool. So yeah, as I was mentioning, we adopted this community engaged process, which Suzanne sort of mentioned, working with community advisors at every step of the research process. So the research involved sort of a mixed methods approach, and that involved an internet survey that also had a paper component for folks who preferred to fill it out that way. And the internet survey ended up getting 673 respondents. This was split in a way that skewed a little bit towards Sudbury, where we had 405 and 266 in Windsor. And then we also conducted around 50, exactly 50 face-to-face interviews this past summer. And once again, slight skew towards Sudbury. It was 26 participants in Sudbury and 24 participants in Windsor. And recruitment for both phases of the process of the project occurred both in person at Pride events, but also through our community partners and ads posted on social media. Next slide. So the breakdown of the sample, our 673 participants came from a range of backgrounds. The majority of participants were under the age of 35, with less representation from older adults. And with regards to sexual orientation, a plurality of participants identified as either bisexual or pansexual, and that was a 33.1% for both of those categories. The majority of participants were cisgender, and 7.6% identified as transgender men or women, and 10.2% identified as either non-binary, genderqueer, gender variant, or gender non-conforming. 12.8% of participants identified as Indigenous, and 26.3% were racialized.
So where were people working? The people who filled out the survey were represented a large cross-section of industry sectors. However, our sample was overrepresented in some sectors and underrepresented in others. And so this gives us an indication, and it matches some other data that we have for Canada that shows that 2SLGBTQ people tend to be overrepresented in low-wage service sector occupations. So we had an overrepresentation compared to the actual distribution across industry categories for Sudbury and Windsor. We had an overrepresentation in accommodation and food service and in retail work. And we had an underrepresentation in manufacturing and in mining. 38.7% of our sample was unionized, 36% made less than $20,000 a year, almost a quarter were working in multiple jobs. We also had a sizable sample that was present in education and health. However, actually, these occupations are actually quite common in Sudbury and Windsor, and so they weren't that much of an overrepresentation of the actual communities that they were in. But this matches data for Canada as a whole. So why are people clustered into particular types of sectors? Well, there's two reasons. One is that people don't feel like they can apply to particular types of sectors. So you can look at the one quote here. People might actively avoid going into manufacturing or mining because of the perceptions of that industry won't be accepting. And the second is that people might change industries after they, or leave a job after they're in one to find one that's more supportive. So here we have the percent of people who have changed, who reported that they had changed industries to find a more supportive environment, which was approximately 12% of our total sample, and 20% of people who identified as transgender. And then, actually 36.5% of people who were transgender. And then people who left a job, approximately 20% of our sample left a job to find a more supportive environment, and 25% left a job. So this really reduces the job options of people. About a quarter of transgender workers experience discrimination when finding work, and discrimination contributed to greater job insecurity, lower pay, and less employment mobility because you have less of a range of jobs that you can apply for. Okay, on to you, Ben.
So to talk a little bit about participants' experiences at work, most of the 2SLGBTQ plus people who participated in the study did not feel completely safe or comfortable at work. Approximately half of survey respondents concealed their identity from either supervisors, coworkers, or during teamwork or work events. And 36.3%, or only 36.3% of workers were out to their boss or supervisor, and 13.1% were out to their union. This quote here kind of demonstrates why some folks didn't feel comfortable dealing with some of the people in their workplace. On the next slide, next slide.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Discrimination at work was fairly common, although the majority of it was subtle homophobia and transphobia, which was widespread among this study. As you can see here, about 20.9% or 19.9% of the total sample experienced subtle discrimination from coworkers, and when comparing this with racialized and transgender participants, those groups tended to experience more discrimination, particularly overt homophobia and transphobia. Discrimination was also very common from customers in the survey, and also arose in the interviews coming from employers. Additionally, 29.3% of transgender respondents reported experiencing pronoun discrimination at work or misgendering. And so this was a type of discrimination that was really concentrated among certain subsets of the sample. So mental health was also a large part of the study. The overall mental health of participants supported previous research that shows that transgender and bisexual populations are more likely to have poor mental health compared with the broader population. 19.5% of all participants reported that their overall mental health was not good, and work was critical to participants' experiences of mental health. 72.6% of participants experienced a mental health issue related to their work over the past year. And this ranged from negative experiences and discrimination to unwelcome environments. In the next slide, we have a graph that demonstrates how these sort of negative experiences of mental health related to work varied by industry. And as you can see, folks who worked in the low-wage service sector, so food service, retail, and accommodation, were the most likely to report having negative mental health related to work. And this was also related to an overlap between folks who were in precarious work positions and folks who had negative mental health. After food service, retail, and accommodation, the second most common was management and finance. So participants used a range of strategies to cope with mental health at work. Folks talked about seeking help through therapy and medication, although many expressed that this wasn't always accessible due to cost and insurance reasons. Others talked about how important mental health leave was for dealing with their mental health issues, although this was more common among folks who worked in the public sector, as people who have access to mental health leave is very much segmented by industry. And additionally, some participants talked about using substances to deal with mental health issues related to work. On our slide, we have a quote from a non-binary worker in Windsor who talked about using alcohol a little bit as a form of escapism from work due to their negative experiences of discrimination there.
So now we're moving on to talking about unions and employers. So overall, responses to unions, workers felt somewhat supported by their unions, but not entirely so. And we can see that the percent of unionized respondents who said that the union mostly or always protects them from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity really varied by industry. So people who were in public sector unions in education and healthcare tended to feel much more protected than those who were in food service or retail. That might be because of discrimination from customers and they don't feel like the union can protect them from, but also from manufacturing and management. Only about 50% felt protected by the union. These numbers were also lower for transgender and racialized participants. So the overall number was approximately 60% of people felt protected by their union, but this was lower for trans participants as well as those who identified as racialized. In the interviews, we saw that a lot of people didn't feel connected with their unions. 36% of survey participants had never contacted their union, and 18 interviewees described feeling disconnected. Often people would not seek help from their union had they experienced discrimination. As far as employers, people felt in general more supported by their employers. Here we can see a graph looking at the percentage of people who said that their employer is somewhat supportive or very supportive to people who identify as 2SLGBTQ+. And once again, this varies by industry sector. So we see that people in management and finance said that their employers were somewhat supportive or very supportive, and this was actually lower in education and healthcare. The interesting thing, though, is that many of our respondents were not out at work, as we saw previously, and particularly in some of these industries, such as manufacturing, management, and finance, we know people weren't out. So they might be saying their employer, they believe their employer to be supportive, but they're not out at work. So there's a little bit of a contradiction here, particularly since only 36% of our interviewees, well, not our interviewees, but of our survey respondents said that they were out to their employers. So some of this was tied to people's experiences in the community. Many people who weren't out at work were also not out in their local communities. And many described feelings of isolation and feeling like they didn't have places to get support. But many also noted some progress. And so this is a kind of positive message of change where we see there's communities that there's like a growing presence of LGBTQ activities and service organizations. And in general, people who were involved in those organizations felt more community and felt less isolated. So one non-binary person stated, I think it's probably getting better. This year at the parade was fantastic. I thought, well, this is pretty freaking awesome. Like I was impressed. It was a long parade for Windsor. So we got a lot of messages of change and people saying it's been bad in the past, but things are changing and things are changing for the better. So this is a positive message.
In all of our interviews, we asked participants to describe what they would like to see from their unions and from their employers. And we got a range of responses, but they tended to focus on both symbolic actions that sort of signify support and material changes to the way that structures are set up and how the workplace or union operates. So to speak specifically about some recommendations for unions, this sort of idea of a symbolic support was brought up when folks explained that they wanted the union to publicly demonstrate that they're an ally to the 2SLGBTQ+ community. And this could be through attending parades, through speaking out in the workplace, but then also through material practices. So creating 2SLGBTQ+ community committees at work to help build community and to address sort of common concerns. As well as making it really clear that the union will address the workplace issues that are specific to 2SLGBTQ+ workers. And this can be through collective bargaining or through grievance procedures, but really making it clear that these structures and processes are available to these members. Employers, there was a similar sort of idea in terms of material practices, really enforcing the anti-discrimination and harassment policies if there are any in place, and if there aren't, creating those and making them really clear. And it's important to note that these policies also need to be enforced with customers, because we got a really a lot of participants reported experiencing discrimination and violence from customers, and those are customers are often not thought of as being the source of discrimination at work, and so that's something that needs to be incorporated. And then back to that symbolic idea, publicly demonstrating support for the 2SLGBTQ+ community and signaling the workplace as an inclusive place, both through sort of day-to-day communication and also bringing on these bigger changes. And then finally, we had really important recommendations for everyone. The first involves education, unions, employers, coworkers, initiating sort of education and training, such as anti-oppression training, to address racism, transphobia, and homophobia in the workplace, as well as looking at the challenges, the unique challenges experienced by 2SLGBTQ+ workers. And then also supporting community and government initiatives to improve access to 2SLGBTQ+ positive mental health supports. And this includes lobbying, governments, workplaces, unions to ensure access for all to these sorts of supports. And this quote, I think, is really powerful. Silence is often taken as being against, so by not actually being verbally supportive, that is a missed opportunity.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That's all we have. And once again, thank you to everybody who contributed to the study. A lot of people played a big role in this, and thank you so much for your interest in the research, and I look forward to your questions after our other commentators. I look forward to the other panelists' discussions as well.
Very much, Suzanne. And we're going to take a look at our panelists now to hear their thoughts on the report that they've heard, and perhaps also share some of their own experiences in dealing with some of the issues that have arisen as a result of this. And so first I'm going to invite Vincent Bolt from TG Interselves to speak and to join us. So Vincent, if you want to make your camera live and your mic live, that would be wonderful.
There we go. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. There we go. So I had a chance to read through the study, and I was really happy to be a part of the team and provide some advisory for this, because one of the things that I see often working with trans people is challenges with employment, challenges accessing employment, challenges when coming out at work. I've had a number of clients over the years who have had the situation where they come out at work and suddenly, after years of zero incidents or zero complaints, they're suddenly being written up, or suddenly they are experiencing reduced hours, or the work environment changes to one that is far more toxic. And it is something that I hear time and time again. Looking at the statistics around the wages of younger workers versus older workers, it's pretty consistent with what I see. A lot of the youth that I'm working with who are working are earning lower wages, earning less than $20,000 a year, and are working poor. Very few of my clients work in unionized positions, and I've also seen that where they have worked in a place that's unionized in the food industry or service industry, and their unions did very little to protect them when it came to their gender identity or sexual orientation. When looking at the reports and the numbers around trans people being more likely to leave their place of employment because they are trans. So according to this study, it was 24.3% who left the workplace because it was unsupportive, compared to cisgender participants, which left at a rate of 9.1%. I see that a lot. Even if there aren't any outward hostilities by employers, sometimes it's just a shift in the way a person is treated. People become colder towards them, and that's in some situations. In many, it actually is openly hostile. This also has been a good reflection of my work experience, working in the service industry, working in customer service, and then moving on to working in social services, which was a completely different experience, where I went from working in fast food restaurants and call centers and places like that, where I experienced a lot of transphobia from management, from customers, from coworkers, to now working as a social worker, where I'm in a field that's a lot more accepting than those other industries. Not to say that transphobia in this industry doesn't exist, but there's far more education happening to people who work in this field about inclusion. And my thoughts on all of this is that we certainly do need more education in the workplace. So I get a lot of requests from people who work in social services to train their staff, or from people who work in the medical field to train doctors and medical care professionals, but I'm not getting invites to train people who work in industries like mining or construction, or even in areas like customer service. So that's another thing that really needs to shift, and it's that access to training and education outside of just certain fields.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you very much, Vincent. Anybody has questions for Suzanne and Ben about the research, or if they have questions for Ben, please put them into the chat or the Q&A box, and hearing from all the panelists, we will pose those questions to our speakers here today. Next, I'd like to involve Paul Pasanen to join us and share his perspective. So Paul, if you want to click on your camera and click on your mic and come forward at this time, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Scott. And thank you to the team for this opportunity to speak and be part of this study. I think this study it's foundational. It's groundbreaking. I'm very impressed. It's like a fantastic study for Northern Ontario. I would say, well, first of its kind. I have spent a number of years researching aspects of being gay in modern culture and the challenges that queer people, 2SLGBTQ plus people have. And minority stress is one of the focuses of my interests. And this study just brings the data forward so that we can the results. 70-some% of the workers in this study experience mental health and other issues related to their work. I mean, that's significant, and that ties in with a lot of the research and a lot of the stuff that I've been seeing. I think it's culture is a main part of this, and rural and northern geographies have certain cultures. Working class and industrial areas have certain cultures, and those cultures tend to be very heteronormative, homo-negative, trans-negative, cis-normative, and very much supporting that binary of male and female, and not inclusive or kind to anything that's outside of those norms. So if you're two-spirited, if you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, otherwise queer, non-binary, this is noted by people, and it's not appreciated by people in this culture. And it's systemic. It's in the family systems. The research that I've been doing really shows that the queer population's under threat right throughout their entire lives. From very early on, they start getting threatened for not being gender appropriate or not being sexually appropriate. If they get noticed as being a boy being a sissy or a girl being too masculine, or as you get older, you can get kicked out of your house because of your identity. And this is ongoing threat that queer people experience in places like Sudbury and smaller cities. So I find this study has really brought forth the statistics to show what the effect of this ongoing oppressive threat has on people, and it's systemic. It's in the families, it's in the school systems, it's in the job workforce situations, it's in your religions, and it's in the healthcare and social services. This sort of ongoing experience of non-acceptance. One of the quotes in the study it showed that a customer asked to have a service person fired because she didn't like this transgender expression of himself, actually. And I mean, that's the privilege and the permission that cisgendered straight people have in these cultures. You can walk into a workplace and ask for a queer person to get fired because you don't like it. And imagine what that person does to their own children, relatives or their neighbors who happen to not fit into that binary and that, you know, heteronormative box that we're expected to fit into. And the connection between policy and culture and policy. The policies are just the values, the norms, the of people in power, you know, implementing the ideas and the practices in various systems, workplaces, institutions, agencies. And again, this is our workplaces, this is our service industries, and this is also our unions. We could have the support of policy. We do need the procedures and the actions moving forward to help the places change, you know. And I really think this kind of study and, you know, finding out the actual mechanisms of how it works, you know, whether it's microaggressions, bullying, harassment, social exclusion, you know, there's workplaces that, I mean, they can get rid of an employee just by being a little bit more diligent in how someone's evaluated and take every little opportunity to criticize their work, and they have enough, you know, it's constructive dismissal, if you will. And this is the culture of a working class, blue collar, northern rural community. And I think change is slow, but I think we're, with this kind of data and this kind of information, we have the research we need to move forward. We have the information to work towards making those policies and those programs, and, you know, encouraging the queer community to be more forthcoming and more have more solidarity. You know, I really think Sudbury. I mean, I don't know a lot, but Sudbury for sure. I've been raised here, born and raised, and I think we could really use the support as far as developing a queer community and a queer voice to help influence the policy and the procedures across all the systems to make queer people more comfortable in their workplaces, in their families, and in their day-to-day lives. Anyway, I just really want to thank you for this opportunity for me to have a voice and say my piece. And I'm gonna cut it off there because I think I'm getting flashed at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Much appreciated for hearing from you. I'd like to invite Bill, if you're on the line with us, to speak at this time. So are you with us, Bill? Not hearing Bill come on at this time, so we'll keep working on solving those technical issues. And at this time, I'm going to invite Melody Berube from the Sudbury Worker Center to share her perspective. So Melody, if you could pick your camera on and bring up your microphone, and we'd love to hear your perspective on the discussion so far.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that really stood out to me personally was just how self-conscious we really are as a community in a lot of ways. Most respondents really didn't think that the community perceived them very negatively, and yet still more than half of us weren't actually comfortable enough to be out in the community, and similarly at work as well. So I think that really speaks volumes to the concern and fear that just exists living as a queer person. We really are constantly under our own microscope because we're so used to being there socially. And I think so many of us are really hyper aware of how our gender or our sexuality is or can be perceived by people. I think that a lot of straight cisgender people just miss that, and how much that can really play into how, when, and where queer people do feel comfortable reaching out for help and reaching out for services. Especially thinking more specifically to unions. I think a lot of unions would really be shocked to know just the numbers of their members that actually reach out to us as the worker center. And a lot of the time, those individuals who are reaching out, it's because that worker is part of a minority group, right? So typically there's somebody racialized or queer. And they're coming to us because they already don't feel like their union is supportive. They don't feel like they can speak to somebody. They don't feel like their concern is going to be taken seriously. There's a lot of fear there, right? And I think that's so important, is that what we need to understand is that perception is greater than reality in so many ways, right? If your queer members perceive the union to be unsupportive, or the employer to be unsupportive, or to not have the resources or knowledge to help them, then it doesn't really matter if that's not the case at all, right? It just matters that that's the way it's perceived, because that's gonna affect the way people act. And that's really substantiated in the report when you look at the fact that, you know, workers who felt that their employers were more supportive of 2SLGBTQ people were actually, you know, far less likely to hide their identity. And even people who knew their employer were supportive still felt the need to hide their identity in some form or fashion. So I think that really speaks volume of just the perception that, hey, you know, this is taken seriously in the workplace, or this is being looked at, or, you know, they feel strongly enough about it to make sure that they are recognized as an ally, or trying to be an ally. Those things can really be so important. And it can really be a barrier if they're not seeing that, right? And the reality is that, yes, a lot of those barriers are going to be mental barriers, because like Paul pointed out, you are dealing with populations with minority stress theory, right? Who are not as likely to reach out because they're used to getting the wrong response, or they're used to getting ridiculed, or they're used to not getting help, right? And it's literally a way of accommodating ourselves and protecting ourselves by just not raising it as an issue, right? Or waiting until it's already such a huge issue by the time you even raise it in the workplace. And that's a lot of the time what I deal with, right? I see a lot of queer people who don't want to say anything and are just hoping that it goes away, and that, you know, if they don't make it an issue, that it'll slow down, it'll go away. And by the time they come to us, it's already too late, and things have already progressed so much. And that's a lot of the situations where you see it's already a toxic work environment. And we see a lot of employers that would rather just get rid of that worker than have to deal with the toxic environment and deal with the violence and harassment in the workplace, whether that be coming from other coworkers, clients, right, or even supervisors or management. We see a lot of the time it's easier for them to just get rid of people, right? Oh, you're just not a good fit, or oh, you're not quite meeting our standards. It's just easier for a lot of employers. So the one thing I would really say, that it comes back to those recommendations that Ben was talking about, and that was really brought up by participants, right, is don't discount the relevance of those small acts, right? Things like having a committee, if you're a union, right? Having even some pride stuff in your office, whether that be having some flags around, some stickers, any small thing like that, right? And I think a lot of the time, straight people won't even notice these things, right? It kind of just goes over their head. But for queer people, it is absolutely a dog whistle. You know, we see it. Even if it's a small, subtle thing. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that something as small as, you know, a pride sticker in a teacher's door, or a pride sticker in a medical office has really been a lifeline for queer people, right? That in some small way, we're being seen, and we might even be heard if we need to raise an issue. So as much as it's important to think about those wider things, those more long-term recommendations that do involve a lot of time, money, and energy, like gender neutral washrooms, right? Changing spaces that include non-binary people, that aren't just, you know, male, female, benefits that include people who are transitioning, things of that nature. It requires an investment. It requires you to throw money behind it. It requires you to do that work. But while you are doing those larger policy things, there are absolutely small things you can put in place to make sure that people know that we see you, we support you, and you can come to us. Because as we saw in the report, that was a lot of the barriers, was queer people are so used to a certain response, and a lot of those responses are informed by our lived experiences. So if we've had problems at work before, right, if you've experienced harassment in the workplace, if you've dealt with a coworker that was harassing you, you're probably a lot less likely to feel comfortable coming out in your next job, right? So all those experiences kind of compound, and it can lead to a lot of people being very afraid or concerned to express themselves in whatever way that is. So I think that's a huge barrier, is just in terms of unions and organizations, of making sure that you do have some things in place. Because I think it's really easy to say, you know, as a union, oh, well, you know, this hasn't been an issue, or nobody's raised it as a problem, or, oh, we don't have any gay members. And that's maybe not the case, right? You're maybe just not seeing them. And that can be part of the problem. So I think please just don't discount those small acts and how much that can mean, and how much that can really raise awareness and raise the dialogue, right? Because the best thing you could do is be having those conversations with queer people. We can see it in recommendations. Queer people know what we need. We know what recommendations are going to work for us. They've been things that we've been saying on and on and on and on. This is what we need. It's just that we need organizations and unions to take that seriously and to try and actually implement those things so that people do feel comfortable coming out at work and being honest about their gender and sexuality, both at work and in our community. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. Very much appreciated. Bill, are you on the line with us now? Are you able to join and share your perspective?
Yes, I am.
Great, thank you, Bill.
I'm going to try the camera too. Nope, can't do the camera. So that's okay. All right, so I'm here. So can you hear me now? I want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this. It was an eye-opening study to look at what small towns have to deal with, much like what we dealt with when I came out 20 years ago in General Motors in Oshawa. It was not a happy time. I was outed, so I had no control over how things went. I went into work one Monday morning and found out everybody knew. 20 years hence, I was, before General Motors closed, I was a health and safety rep, also the co-chair of the Human Rights Committee for the union, and also on the Ontario Regional Council Pride Committee. So I did a lot of work going from community to community to help people to find out who they were, to have the space to speak on and to speak on their behalf if they requested that. My experience in the plant, still right up to the closure, was people were closeted because they were afraid. They saw people respected me, but at the same time, their past experience, as Melody said, came back to haunt them and kept them quiet, kept them in the shadows. So I was looking at what can you do to make things better for people, and unless the company sets something from the top and the workplace, there's nothing really that union members can do, because if the supervisors coming in are going to pick on somebody because of their orientation, the union can fight all they want, but if they keep bringing in these people who just graduate from college in business administration and think they know everything, it creates of course a toxic situation, and other workers who might normally have been targeted are going to side with the supervisor to take pressure off themselves, just basic human nature. So my experience was, people would call me names walking down the aisle. I was much like the first women that went into General Motors in the 70s that were whistled at and offered dates every time they walked down the line. Then the first people of color that came into Oshawa once the Scarborough van plant closed, same situation, the harassment that they felt. And so I was just, the new kid on the block. So people have come out, a lot of people have come out since they left General Motors, feeling safe now just to live their lives. And these are people who of course have retirement age. People who are new and young don't have that opportunity. So I really hope that going forward, all the workplaces might look at your study and realize there's valuable information in there for workplaces to initiate and to make people feel more comfortable where they're working. Again, as a retiree now, I can travel all around to help people, and I have been doing that. I was speaking to a friend yesterday and be going up to visit her, someone who I've grown to absolutely adore. So it's I'm lucky, I'm fortunate. I've had a really good opportunity because of the union, but at the same time, it had to be pushed for. They were never forthcoming in recognizing us as valuable members of the union until we pushed and demanded and took our space. And sometimes it takes, you know, us just stepping forward and being strong. So really important for us to know who our allies are and grab those allies and keep them close to us and have them put us forward and have them put us on the executives of our local to make sure that we have that voice always. Again, with some workplaces, you see that there are more LGBTQ, as Paul mentioned, and also when there's more people in that from our community, we can look at it and say, well, you know, they must have an easier ride, but they still have to deal with customers. They still have to deal with the public. So whatever preconceived ideas they are brought into the workplace, I mean, it doesn't always hold true. It doesn't always hold that it's safer because there are more. Theater arts might be somewhere to, you know, you think of that kind of thing when someone meets them afterwards and they say, oh, well, I don't agree with your lifestyle. It's nobody's business who we are. We're who we are. We don't choose to be gay. It's who we are, and people need to get over that choice thing. It's not a choice. It's who we are. I love who I am. I love my partner. I have children, and my children love him. So we're very fortunate. And going forward, I hope that all our younger people that you know, and as our mnemonic expands further and further, hopefully that we can all embrace these new people that come in, because they're actually expressing their truth and their identity, and we need to make sure that those people understand that we're there to support them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Much appreciated for you to take the time to share your perspective. So that's all of the panelists that we had for today. And so now we're going to turn it over to your questions. Michaela has been gathering them in the chat box. I know many of you have put in lots of excellent questions. So I'm going to invite Michaela to join us now and to share some of the questions for our panelists.
All right, so to start it off, I'm going to direct the first one to Suzanne and Ben. So we had somebody say, I really appreciate all this research that has been done. I'll definitely be using it in my work, but they'd like to know why were Sudbury and Windsor chosen and not other municipalities? You're still muted, Suzanne. Suzanne, you're still muted. So Scott, are you able to unmute her from your end?
Sorry about that. I thought I had unmuted. I had to double click and stuff. So partially the focus was knowing that there's been very little research done on Northern Ontario LGBTQ plus communities, and knowing that there are areas that are often kind of neglected. I'm originally from Northern Ontario, so I have a vested interest in Northern Ontario. Why we chose Sudbury versus other Northern Ontario communities was partially because we knew there was enough of a LGBTQ community infrastructure in terms of service organizations that it would be more easy to implement the research. We knew that if we chose, for example, even Sault Ste. Marie, it'd be harder, it'd be more difficult because there isn't as active of an LGBTQ community. So I think we could take the results from these communities and say that in other communities, people might feel even more isolated. As far as Windsor, we were looking also for a location. We were looking for a parallel community that had a strong union history. And our two partners on the research were United Steelworkers and Unifor. And we know that Unifor, its kind of area of strength in the country has traditionally been in the automotive sector in Windsor. That's where they have the really strong union power, and that's where there's, so in a sense, they have this kind of deindustrialization happening, but they also still have fairly strong labor movement. And that parallels with Sudbury, where the United Steelworkers, one of the strongest locals it has in the country, has historically been 6,500. So we're interested in these two communities in terms of kind of comparing them and looking at them for these reasons.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so this one is again for you, Suzanne, or Ben, whichever. So we have Richard, who is a rep with UFCW 175-633, and Richard would like to ask a question regarding the low percentage of workers being out to their union. How was this question placed? Would this have included stewards, unionized coworkers? And then fascinating study, happy to share it with colleagues.
Great, thank you. Ben, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Richard. So this question was specifically asking folks if they were out to people in their union, and then we listed a couple examples: stewards, representatives, staff. So it was sort of like a broad capturing people who were out or not to their union as a whole. And yeah, the numbers are quite low, and are something that I think that we wanted to investigate a little bit further.
What did people say in the interviews about that, Ben?
Yeah, I think that the interviews unraveled sort of another side of this, which was, as Suzanne talked about, that like kind of idea of disconnect. So for a lot of members, I mean, some talked about how they found that their unions might be sort of negative or discriminatory environments. That was a very small subset of unionized interview participants. But then we had that other sort of theme of disconnect. And so it wasn't always that participants weren't out to their unions because of sort of a conscious decision, but it was maybe also because a large percentage of unionized participants didn't attend union meetings or didn't have any contact with their union at all. And some talked about how that they just didn't know what kind of supports were out there, particularly around 2SLGBTQ plus issues. And so that was something that really came up and was reinforced, is that unions need to make a really concerted effort to connect with members, and particularly 2SLGBTQ plus members.
One suggestion that was made when I gave a presentation to the United Steelworkers staff was that they do a little initiation or a little kind of introduction to the union session. And they said actually just bringing up LGBTQ issues at that session would be something that they were going to think about implementing. I think I'm not sure if UFCW does those types of sessions, but I know that some workplaces do, and that might be a thing where it could be incorporated.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so another one for Suzanne and Ben, common trend. So nationally, do we see the same trends in data between Canada and USA? Were there differences between the two community studies? And they're curious to identify if Windsor, being a border town, was different and could be influenced by the US neighbor. Interesting one.
I could speak a little bit. I would say, as far as Windsor being influenced by the US, the results in Windsor and Sudbury were almost identical. There was no statistical difference between Windsor and Sudbury. So I would say there was some influence, some of the American influence came up through the interviews. There were more mentions of Trump. There were more incidences where people kind of said, well, I'd hear people talking about Trump, or I'd hear people saying super anti-immigrant types of things, and that would make them feel less comfortable. So I think that would be the American influence that came in. But in terms of statistics and discrimination, they're almost identical between the communities. As far as comparing to, I actually can't speak very clearly about comparing to the US data, but comparing to the Canadian data, in larger cities, I know in Hamilton, for example, we did another survey, the percentage out at work was actually higher in Hamilton, it was lower here. It was lower in these communities, which is what I would kind of expect. And the other data that I would compare with, a lot of the data that you do find doesn't include trans people, and it only looks at lesbian and gay and bisexual people. And if we look at the distribution of people across jobs, that was very similar to other studies, both in Canada and the US, in terms of the types of jobs people are in terms of the types of discriminations people face. But in terms of the exact numbers, that's where you might find some differences. I'm not sure, can you add anything to that, Ben?
Yeah, I think that you kind of captured a lot. And I think that a lot of the literature that comes from the United States isn't quite as broad and exploratory as this research, just in terms of capturing like, across the 2SLGBTQ plus spectrum. So it's I don't think in terms of literature I've seen anything that really compares one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to throw another one to you too. So you mentioned that employers and unions could improve on how we included the interests of the 2S LGBTQ plus community in our collective agreements. I'm interested to know if you have any examples of collective agreement articles that your survey takers shared that they would like to see included at bargaining.
Ben?
I don't have any examples of anything specifically that was shared, but I know that like previous unions have used collective bargaining to provide funds for gender affirmation surgery, mental health leaves. Suzanne, do you remember any other examples from?
I mean, historically, there are a lot of examples, right, in terms of like unions were at the forefront, I'm sure you know this, of ensuring same-sex health benefits and that sort of thing. And I think that is particularly an issue, or has been more in the US because this happened in Canada in the 1990s. But more recently, there have been things around, like you said, associated with trans people, associated with the use of gender pronouns, and then also with transition and but mental health leaves, I think that is something for all workers, right? But it's something that might particularly help LGBTQ plus workers. Those would be the examples that I'm aware of primarily, yeah. And anti-discrimination, including explicit language around gender and sexual minorities in your anti-discrimination statement in the collective agreement. There's other small things too, like for example, agreements that use very gendered language. So I read a lot of mining collective agreements, and often they use male pronouns throughout the collective agreement. And then they have a clause that says this includes men and women. But I think a good exercise would be to replace all of those with gender neutral pronouns, because it sends a message. This is a workplace that's for men. And this is, you get that message if every article in your collective agreement has he and him and whatnot.
Awesome, thank you. It's a very good suggestion. So this one's going to go out to all of the panelists. Suzanne and Ben, you can comment first if you'd like, and then we can open it up to the rest of them. But they would like to see if anybody could talk about how the concepts of diversity versus inclusivity manifest in the workplace. Are these terms viewed as interchangeable, and do you find that to be a problem or not?
Someone else can go ahead, but I do have a quick answer for myself. But
you can go ahead and then we can open it up to Mel or Vincent.
I think this question, what I'm guessing is that it comes from this history of diversity management, which is a kind of corporate tool or that's been used to talk about diversity in the workplace. And so historically, there was this idea of promoting diversity, having diversity management, and that's the idea that everybody has differences and we'll just kind of be equally appreciative of all these differences, and these differences will then, if we value the differences, then any sort of inequalities will disappear. Actually, often, and the idea is that our corporation will be better if we just value everybody's unique differences. Now, this comes into a problem, and that will be better for profitability. Now, there's issues with this kind of diversity approach. One, because it doesn't necessarily acknowledge the power structures that already exist, and by not acknowledging them, such as like racism or homophobia or transphobia, it makes it hard to address them. I mean, it's one part, which is valuing differences, that is good, but the use of the language of diversity can kind of homogenize hierarchy and discrimination that's happening and not call attention to it. And so, and it can also kind of flatten how we approach things. So yes, inclusivity is a better type of language to use because it's talking about ensuring that people are really included. But I personally kind of sometimes avoid the word diversity for that reason. But I don't have as much knowledge about this inclusivity term, so perhaps someone else can speak to
that. Is there anybody else, Melody, Vincent, Bill, Paul, who would like to comment on this?
I would to mention that queer people in general, I mean, one of the social determinants of health that I've been looking at is social inclusion and or social exclusion, and queer people tend to be excluded from their families, from their religions, in school situations, in job situations, and if you're just talking about diversity, like Suzanne was saying, you flatten it out, and the exclusion can continue. I think you need to specify the minorities that you wish to include and address the various oppressions and oppressive behaviors and systematic oppression, so that you can be inclusive. So there's an active part to the policies. You can have a diversity policy or even an inclusivity policy, but if you do not have procedures that follow it up, like training, like safe space acknowledgements, you know, and even enforcing it with other clients. Like one problem with safe space is that when transgender or queer or LGBT two-spirited people come into a space sign, but the client beside you could be spouting all kinds of homophobic and transphobic crap. And if that's happening, then you don't feel safe. So enforcing a safe space policy includes training and the kind of expectation of staff to do that kind of thing. That's inclusivity, proactive. And I really think that is a better wording for things. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Suzanne. So the next question we have, oh, Vincent, would you like to comment on that?
I would. And as somebody who's done a lot of the training for workplaces in the area and continues to do that, it doesn't stop with a 1-hour presentation or a full-day training. And it doesn't matter what you call it. You could use the most politically correct and inclusive terms. It really comes down to what your practices are and what your procedures are and how they're enforced, how you respond in the situation. And the training is a tool, so you learn how to respond and how to make these.
I find it very exciting.
But you know what a lot of people do is, you know, they attend a training and then they get a rainbow sticker and they put it on their door. And that's great. But when that one staff member who put that sticker up, who attended that training, leaves, and the next staff member comes in who didn't have that training and that sticker is still on the door and they say something really ignorant, you're then discrediting the whole process of, you know, creating these inclusive spaces or safer spaces. So it's an ongoing thing. You can't just train all your staff once and say, you know, I'm done, I've done my work, I have my ally sticker. It is ongoing work and retraining as turnover happens in workplaces, continuing to re-examine your policies and procedures and putting these things into practice, and also listening to community members when they say this is messed up and taking their complaints seriously.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on this before we move on? I'm going to take that as a no. So the next question was directed to Ben. And the question is, what were some of the best prevention or support structures that you heard of in your interviews?
That's a good question. Well, so I'll speak a little bit to something that I focused on in my own research, which is incidents of customer violence and discrimination, which is something that really came up in a lot of the interviews as sort of like another workplace actor that's involved in discrimination. And in terms of support and prevention, a lot of participants talked about how it was so important when their employers actively intervened in instances of discrimination, even especially those subtle acts of discrimination, because they so often go unnoticed. And so speaking up, intervening, especially to a customer who's sort of the source of profit for the firm, that was a really powerful sort of gesture or a way to sort of set up the workplace. But then also, in terms of support, the biggest thing that came up in the interviews was, again, providing access to to mental health leaves, and that was fairly rare. And even some folks who had access to mental health leaves said that those leaves were accompanied by a pay cut that was ended up making them prohibitive. And so, in addition to making these accessible to workers, we also need to think about how they're set up and if they're even something that's feasible for people to take. So those were two of the main things that I think came up along those lines.
Awesome, thank you so much for that. So we have about 5 minutes left for questions. And while I don't think this question could be answered in 5 minutes, I'd like to just kind of propose it to all of the panelists to maybe think about. So somebody was wondering if there's anybody who would like to speak to the intersectional realities of being queer and not white while living in colonized cities. So I don't know if Suzanne or Ben, you want to quickly talk about that, Mel even?
Yeah, I wanted to take that on quickly because that speaks to another comment we had as well, from another commenter actually just saying that they've been working with the community group in GTA, which has been flagged as problematic by racialized in other communities. And I want to say that intersectionality is a huge thing. It is so huge, and it is still a huge problem in our community, and that's very clear, right? And that was actually reflected in the responses as well, right? It's, well, you know, if I'm a person of color, I'm going to be less likely to be out because I can't hide my skin color. That's already a challenge for me. That's already a huge barrier. I don't want to be queer on top of that, right? So yes, I think intersectionality is a huge area that is challenging, especially inside the LGBTQ community, and that is where perception can be very important as well, as we always need to be making more headway on there, and that comes into the aspect of inclusion, right? Is it's all well and good that we're trying to be inclusive, but we could always take it a step further. Things like land acknowledgements are great, but is that really giving people a voice? Is that making them feel comfortable? Does it mean that we have spaces for those individuals, right? And how do we really account for that? So go ahead, Suzanne. I could see you're chomping at the bit here.
Yeah, so I would say two things. One is that some of our most surprising results were the incidents of discrimination and harassment faced by particularly Black respondents and racialized respondents. Black respondents were 6 times as likely to have physical harassment from white respondents. We also we weren't successful in necessarily having a good representation of people who are racialized in our community advisory committees, although we tried, but we did have fairly good representation of Indigenous people. And I also did some work with S.W.E.A.C, the Indigenous Health Center in Sudbury, and I brought a colleague of mine who's Two-Spirit to come and speak and stuff. So we had very, very good representation of Indigenous people in the survey and in the interviews, and those insights actually did bring up. Right now, I actually have 2 Indigenous undergrad students who are particularly looking at the Indigenous interview respondents to kind of look through and see what's there additionally. But definitely, we know that things are much more challenging for people who are Indigenous than people who are racialized as non-white. So that's very important. And in Sudbury, even when we were doing the study, I was approached by at least 2 women who were immigrants from Nigeria, new immigrants who were looking for services, and they said, and there were no services available for them in Sudbury because there were services for trans people, services for youth, but and services for Two-Spirit people, but for immigrants who are new in the community, who are perhaps English is their second language, but then who also are facing racism and also are 2SLGBTQ, then they face a lot of challenges. And I think if there's any way that people can think about creating some specific supports for that group, that would be very good.
Awesome, thank you. Is there any other panelists who would like to quickly touch on that? We have about like 2 minutes left before we wrap up. I'm going to take that as a no. So Suzanne, we have quite a few questions that we weren't able to get to just because of time. So is there a way that these people could reach out to you to ask you these questions? Because they are actually some very interesting questions.
Great. For sure. I mean, you can email me and Ben. I think my email is smills@mcmaster.ca. So it's smills@mcmaster.ca. So feel free to email me the questions, or Ben. Ben, what's your email again? I think it's owensb2
at McMaster.ca.
owensb2@mcmaster.ca.
Yeah.
So you can email both of us, and we are very happy to answer your questions. So thank you so much for your interest.
Perfect. So we'll send out their emails in a follow-up email to all of the attendees today. And then if you guys have any further questions, you can send them along to Suzanne and Ben. And I believe I'm handing it back over to Scott to close off for us.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Very much appreciate you handling all those questions, and thank you everyone for all of the excellent questions that you asked, and to our panelists for jumping in and helping to move this conversation forward. I just wanted again to plug that we do have a Worker Center meeting this evening. If you'd like to continue some of this conversation, we'd be delighted for you to join us at our monthly meetings where we discuss the actions that we are taking in the community to try and make things better for all. I just wanted to thank all of the participants in the project, and specifically today, very much a huge thank you to Suzanne and to Ben for all of your excellent research and all of the data that you've gathered. I know this was a huge undertaking for you, and it's so wonderful to have this information, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us. I also want to give a really big thank you to Melody and Vincent and Paul and Bill, our panelists, for sharing your excellent perspectives on things, and for all of the work that you do and continue to do in the queer community, in your workplaces, in just making things better. So a big thank you. And also thank you to Shondell and to Michaela for keeping things moving back behind the scenes and answering all the questions and curating the questions in the chat. Very much everybody for coming out. Please do get in touch with us if you want more information. We will send an email that has the report attached to it and information on how you can contact Suzanne and Ben. And we're always open if you have questions or have had concerns at work and you'd like to talk with us about your legal avenues to explore those. We're happy to provide you with legal information on all of that. So thank you, everybody. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Merci beaucoup, miigwech.